Gather round, boys, girls, and others, because it's time for Uncle Peter to take you on a journey to a world that time has forgotten. Or rather, a world that I have forgotten because I'm so gosh darned old now, and my memory isn't what it once was. Indeed, as is the case for most industries, the video game world has come on in leaps and bounds over the past few decades, to the point where it's basically unrecognizable when compared to what it was in the 80s and 90s. Some things that would have been unimaginable then are now fairly standard, whereas certain things that were once commonplace are now considered archaic. For today's list then, we're taking a look back at some of the practices that used to be the norm for video game fans, but that have now become obsolete thanks to advancements in the industry. We're not saying that absolutely no one does these things anymore ever, just that they were once things that we players did without thinking about it that are now largely unnecessary. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 things gamers just don't do anymore. Number 10. Using cheat codes. Now, don't get us wrong, even these days we're still up for dropping the odd motherload or two when we're running low on cash in The Sims 4. After all, that hot tub isn't going to buy itself, but whilst cheat codes aren't unheard of in today's games, they are far less common than they used to be. If you're one of our younger viewers, you might not be familiar with the term cheat code at all, so allow me to clue you in. Back in the olden days of gaming, developers used to include ways of making games easier, or at least more interesting, by allowing players to enter certain codes using their controllers. These codes had all manner of effects, from bestowing the player with extra lives, or turning them into household objects. However, modern titles tend not to have cheats, or if they do, they're hidden behind some sort of endgame bonus menu, and this is partly due to the rise in the popularity of online gaming. After all, it's one thing to buff yourself against AI enemies, but it's a little unfair if you're doing it against real-life opponents. Some players do still cheat at video games, of course, but if you're caught doing it, it's likely that the devs will slap you with a lifetime ban for your trouble. That is to say that most cheating that takes place nowadays is done by way of hacking, rather than mashing your controller and waiting for a satisfying little ding sound effect to tell you that yes, you are a naughty boy or girl. Number 9. Buying physical game guides or calling tip helplines. If you're playing a video game these days and come across a segment that baffles you, you need only undertake a quick Google search in order to find the answers that you seek. Once upon a time though, things weren't quite so simple, and if you found yourself stuck on a certain level, you didn't have very many options. One thing you could do was invest in a guide, which took the form of a physical book with a walkthrough of the entire game. It didn't matter if you literally only needed it to help you with one stage, you'd still have to fork out for the entire thing, and usually they weren't cheap. Alternatively, and assuming you had your parents' permission to use the phone, you could call the game's helpline. Yes, that's right. Back in the day, some companies offered players phone numbers they could call in order to get help with their games. One of the most notable was the Nintendo Power Hotline, which was set up in 1987 to help gamers who were struggling to beat Nintendo titles. Thanks to the rise of the internet and online guides, video game hotlines and guidebooks are largely a thing of the past. But in ye olden times, they were something that no gamer could live without. Unless you had an older sibling, I suppose. Number 8. Blowing into cartridges. Look, I don't want to get all kids these days, but I'm going to, because kids these days will never know the struggle of trying to get a video game cartridge to function properly. You see, long ago, games didn't get onto your console via the internet or through a shiny disc. No sir. Games came on a big hefty plastic cartridge that slotted into the top of your console, and rather than a laser reading the cartridge's contents, the information was transmitted through dozens of little contacts. When they were working, cartridges were great, but because of their complex shape, players would often plop them into their consoles and find that something was interfering with the connection, preventing them from playing the game. The universal solution for this problem was to remove the cartridge, flip it upside down, take a big deep breath, and then blow into it, thereby dislodging any dust or fluff that might have gotten stuck in there. And you know what? Despite the manufacturers very much telling us all not to do this, 99 times out of 100, it actually worked. I do miss this. You'll never find yourself having to blow into the face of your PS5 because your download of God of War Ragnarok won't boot up. Take me back. Number 7. Tripping over controller cords. Wireless technology is brilliant, isn't it? You can connect to the internet without having to plug into a modem, make a phone call without being tethered to a wall, and even charge electronics without cables trailing all over the place. Truly a marvel of the modern age. Even video game consoles have gotten in on the wireless action in recent years, and players are now free to sit as far away from their screens as they'd like because their controllers can communicate with the consoles without the need for cables. This wasn't always the reality for gamers though, and you only have to go back a few years to find players who were forced to sit within 6 feet of their consoles in order to enjoy their favourite games. Indeed, before wireless technology really took off, video game controllers had to be physically wired to a console. Not only did this mean that players were limited in terms of how mobile they could be while playing their favourite games, but also that they, or more likely their parents or dog, would trip over the trailing cables and do themselves a mischief. We are of course still not quite in a completely cable-less world when it comes to gaming, as you still need to be wired in if you want to charge your controller while playing the game, but certainly there are now far fewer people being grounded by their dad after he's gone head over heels into the coffee table. Once again. Number 6. Pirating games. Now, before anyone goes off in the comments, we're well aware that there are still ways and means of pirating video games. But what we're saying is the methods have very much changed, and the practice is overall far less commonplace than it once was when we were but wee nippers. All clear? Good. Growing up, we all had that one friend whose uncle could get you a copy of basically anything for a small fee. Or there was that one bloke your dad worked with that could get you an R4 card for your Nintendo DS that was loaded with more games than you could shake a stylus at. It was all very illegal and probably killing the industry a bit, but we were kids, so we didn't know any better or care. Fast forward a couple of decades, and anti-piracy measures have come on in leaps and bounds, so it's both more difficult to pirate games, and even if you do, it's likely that video game companies will be one step ahead of you, and as a player, you'll suffer some nasty consequences. We did a video all about it, in fact. Go and check that out after this one if you like. Grand Theft Auto 4, for example, punishes players using illegitimate copies by disabling the brakes on their cars and implementing a permanent drunken effect on the camera. In the world of GTA, crime may pay well, but in the real world, it turns out that it really doesn't. Number 5. Constantly switching input cables and finding the right channel. No matter whether you're on Team Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo these days, setting up a console is now very simple. You plug it into the wall, connect it to your TV via HDMI, maybe stick in an Ethernet cable if you're feeling cheeky, and boom, ready to go. A few years ago, however, things weren't quite so straightforward. For starters, there was a time when console input cables weren't standardized, so flipping between one machine and another wasn't as simple as taking the lead out of the back of one console and putting it into a different one. No. Then there was the conundrum of where the ends of those input cables went in the TV, because quite often they had 3 different coloured plugs meant for different ports on your TV, and if you didn't get them in the right place, nothing would work. And speaking of TVs, they weren't even standardised either, so you could end up in a situation of having a console with an RCA connector where your TV only had a SCART port. Oh, and don't even get me started on having to flip through all the channels to find the right one. Thank the maker for HDMI cables and the source button. That's all I'm saying. Number 4. Using memory cards. If you never had to experience it, it's hard to imagine a time where games didn't just save to the console. It might interest you to know, though, that there was once a period of time where video games didn't save at all. And so if you wanted to finish them, you had to do so in a single sitting, or leave your console running overnight and hope your mum or one of your horrid siblings didn't turn it off. If you were lucky, there might have been a password system allowing you to load up an instance of the game matching where you left off, but those were few and far between at times. Thankfully, those days are long gone, but even we spry young things can remember when you used to have to insert memory cards into the console. Indeed, the likes of the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2 didn't have built-in storage. And so, if you wanted to save your progress in the likes of Metal Gear Solid, Spyro the Dragon, or Tomb Raider, you'd need to stick in a memory card. These little squares were a lifesaver for gamers, but the problem was that they didn't hold very much. And so if you were an avid player, as we here at Team TripleJump were, and still are to this day, you'd need a lot of them. And although it was a bit of a faff trying to remember which one had your Final Fantasy VII save and which one had your Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone save, I do still kind of miss these guys. RIP memory cards. Number 3. Queuing for midnight launches. For a while, it was common for video games and consoles to launch at midnight, and for stores to open especially so that excited gamers could get their hands on the latest release. Very often, players would queue for hours outside their local game shop in order to secure a copy of a hotly anticipated title or a brand new machine so they could run home and get to playing it immediately. There was jubilation from those who were able to secure their preferred purchase, and heartbreak for those who hadn't joined the queue early enough. Technology has moved on somewhat since then though, and so freezing your nards off in the middle of the night in order to get your mitts on a copy of the latest Call of Duty is now a thing of the past. Instead, players can either pre-install games thanks to the marvel that is digital downloads, or simply await the arrival of their friendly neighborhood post person the following morning. We can't say that we don't somewhat miss midnight releases though, as despite the fact that they're responsible for several dozen hours of our lives that we won't get back, we just don't get the same buzz from our clock ticking over and our pre-install unlocking. Number 2. Having to wait for a game to release in your territory. Thanks to innovations like the internet, the world is a much better connected place, which is great news for a number of reasons. You can make friends with people on the other side of the globe, learn about other cultures with the click of a mouse, and gain access to media from other countries as soon as it's released. A few years ago, though, things were quite different, and your location on planet Earth very much dictated what video games you had access to. If you've watched our best or worst of X year videos, then you might have noticed that we sometimes have to call out a game that was released in one year in one part of the world and in a different year in another, and that's just how things used to be. Very often, titles would receive a release in Japan, for example, but not see the light of day elsewhere for months or even years afterwards, if at all. Nowadays, video games generally get a global release, and so we here in the UK usually get to enjoy games at the same time as our overseas brethren. But it's easy to forget that things weren't always that way. And number 1, renting games. These days, if you're looking to play a video game, you've got two options really. You can either buy it outright yourself, although things can get pretty pricey that way, especially in the current climate, or if you've got a friend who still buys physical discs, you might be able to borrow it from them. In decades past though, there was another, more reliable and more affordable option. You see, local retailers like Blockbuster would rent video games to players for a few days at a time for just a few dollary dues. That meant you could pop down to your local rental shop, pay a couple of quid, beat a game, or at least try it and decide you don't like it, and then return it. The closest thing to that nowadays might be Xbox Game Pass or PlayStation Plus, although it's always a roll of the dice as to whether the game you want will feature on those services, and you've got to make sure you're always playing enough to be getting your money's worth. The loss of game rentals is one that we perhaps mourn the most. No spending, let's face it, just shy of £100 on a video game you're only going to play once, no faffing around with trade-ins, and no unplayed games cluttering up your shelves. Why on earth did we ever stop doing this?